Parrot repeats the same word all day, but no one expected this outcome. The neighborhood of Maple Grove was known for its tidy lawns, white picket fences, and quiet evenings. Yet, in one cozy, ivy-covered house at the end of the street, life was anything but ordinary. That house belonged to Mrs. Agnes Porter, a retired school teacher with a penchant for collecting quirky antiques and an undeniable love for her parrot, Kobus. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Let's dive into today's story. Kobus was no ordinary parrot, a vibrant green-winged macaw with emerald feathers, a red forehead, and a curved jet-black beak. He was both striking and mischievous. Known for his sharp wit and uncanny ability to mimic voices, Kobus had become something of a neighborhood celebrity. Whether it was calling out, "Time for tea," or perfectly imitating the doorbell, his antics kept everyone entertained. Mrs. Porter, a sprightly woman in her late 60s, with a crown of white curls and an ever-present floral apron, adored Kobus. She often joked that the parrot was her most talkative companion. Her home, filled with books, vintage clocks, and faded photographs, had a charm that perfectly matched Kobus's lively personality. One sunny morning, as Mrs. Porter sipped her Earl Grey tea by the bay window, Kobus began his usual chatter. "Good morning," he squawked, mimicking her cheerful tone. "Good morning to you too, Kobus," Mrs. Porter replied with a chuckle. She continued her routine, humming a tune as she folded laundry on the couch. But as the morning wore on, Kobus's usual repertoire took an unexpected turn. "Help! Help!" Kobus cried, his voice sharp and urgent. Mrs. Porter paused, raising an eyebrow. "What's gotten into you now, my feathered friend?" she asked, assuming it was another phrase he'd picked up from the crime dramas she loved to watch. But Kobus didn't stop. "Help! Help!" he repeated, flapping his wings as if to emphasize the urgency. Mrs. Porter shook her head. "You're being dramatic, Kobus. Go on, eat your sunflower seeds." Yet the parrot's cries persisted. His tone was different, less playful, and more insistent. As the day stretched into afternoon, Kobus continued, his cries echoing through the house. Mrs. Porter couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. She had always dismissed Kobus's phrases as amusing quirks, but this time his repetition unsettled her. By evening, the phrase had become relentless. "Help! Help!" Kobus shouted, his wings flaring as he hopped from perch to perch. Mrs. Porter sighed, covering his cage with a checkered cloth. "Enough of your antics, Kobus. I need some peace." But the muffled cries continued through the night. Beneath her covers, Mrs. Porter found herself wondering, was it just a coincidence, or was Kobus truly sensing something amiss? The next morning, Mrs. Porter awoke to the same refrain. Kobus, undeterred by the covered cage, was as vocal as ever. As she made her way to the kitchen, she decided to humor him. "All right, you noisy bird," she said, uncovering his cage. "What's all this fuss about?" Kobus tilted his head, his black eyes gleaming with an intelligence that always amazed her. "Help! Help!" he squawked again. Mrs. Porter stared at him for a moment, then glanced toward the window. Outside, Maple Grove was calm and quiet. Children rode their bikes along the sidewalks, and neighbors tended to their flower beds. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Still, a nagging feeling tugged at her. She decided to call her friend Evelyn, a fellow bird enthusiast. "Evelyn, do you think Kobus could be trying to tell me something?" she asked. over the phone. Evelyn chuckled. "Oh, Agnes, you give that bird too much credit. He probably heard something on TV and is just repeating it." "But it feels different this time," Mrs. Porter insisted. "He's so persistent." Evelyn sighed. "Parrots are sensitive creatures. Maybe he picked up on something you didn't notice. Just keep an eye on him." Mrs. Porter hung up, feeling no closer to an answer. Kobus continued his cries as she went about her day. His urgency was undeniable, yet she couldn't decipher its meaning. Later that afternoon, as Mrs. Porter swept the porch, she noticed something unusual. Across the street, near the abandoned Miller property, a faint sound caught her attention. It was distant and muffled, but unmistakably a cry, soft and weak, as if coming from far away. Her heart quickened. Was this what Kobus had been reacting to? She set down her broom and strained her ears, but the sound had faded. Shaking her head, she told herself it was probably nothing. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the neighborhood, the uneasy feeling returned. That night, as she sat in her armchair reading a novel, Kobus's cries reached a fever pitch. "Help! Help!" he screamed, flapping his wings wildly. "All right, Kobus," Mrs. Porter exclaimed, setting down her book. "You win. Let's see what's going on." She grabbed a flashlight and her phone, her pulse quickening as she stepped out into the cool night air. The neighborhood was eerily silent, save for the chirping of crickets. Kobus's cries echoed faintly behind her, urging her forward. The sound she had heard earlier was faint, but still there, a weak, plaintive noise coming from the direction of the Miller property. Summoning her courage, Mrs. Porter headed toward the old, decrepit garage that had stood unused for years. The closer she got, the louder the noise became, until it was unmistakable, a cry for help. Her hands trembled as she dialed 911, explaining what she had heard. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the quiet street, and officers arrived to investigate. Mrs. Porter stood back, clutching her robe tightly as the officers pried open the rusted garage door. What they found inside left her speechless. As the rusted garage door groaned open, the flashlight beams cut through the dim interior, revealing a scene that sent a chill down Mrs. Porter's spine. Among the clutter of old tools, cobweb-covered shelves, and discarded furniture, a small, frail figure huddled in the corner. It was a boy, no older than 8 or 9, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. His knees were drawn to his chest, and his clothes were dirt-streaked and torn. The officers quickly rushed in, speaking in calm tones to the terrified child. "It's okay. You're safe now," one of them said gently, crouching down to meet the boy's eye level. Another officer turned back to Mrs. Porter, who was standing frozen in the driveway, her flashlight clutched tightly in her hand. "You did the right thing calling us," he told her, his expression serious but appreciative. "It looks like he's been here for a while." Mrs. Porter's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh dear," she whispered, her thoughts racing. Who was this child? How had he ended up here? And how on earth had Kobus known something was wrong? The boy, though frightened, allowed the officers to help him out of the garage. He clung to one of them as he stumbled toward the flashing police cars. Mrs. Porter, overcome with concern, stepped closer, though she kept her distance so as not to overwhelm him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked softly. The boy hesitated before replying, in a barely audible voice. "Eli." One of the officers gave her a nod. "Thank you, ma'am. We'll take it from here. He needs medical attention and probably some food and water. We'll also try to figure out where his parents are." As the officers led Eli to the ambulance, Mrs. Porter couldn't help but glance back toward her house, where Kobus's silhouette was visible in the window. The parrot had gone quiet for the first time in 2 days, watching the commotion with his head tilted as if he understood what was happening. The next morning, Mrs. Porter woke up early, her mind still preoccupied with the events of the previous night. She had barely slept, replaying the moment she'd heard the faint cry, followed by Kobus's relentless calls. She couldn't shake the feeling that her parrot had somehow known what no one else could. While she brewed her morning tea, Kobus let out a cheerful "Good morning," as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Mrs. Porter walked over to his cage, peering at him with a mixture of awe and amusement. "You're something else, you know that?" she said, giving him a piece of apple. "How did you know that boy needed help?" Kobus squawked in response, tilting his head and preening his feathers. Mrs. Porter chuckled, though she still felt a pang of unease. She'd decided to visit the local police station later that day to check on Eli. When Mrs. Porter arrived at the station, she was greeted warmly by one of the officers who had been on the scene the previous night. "Mrs. Porter," he said, offering her a cup of coffee. "Thanks for coming in. We were actually hoping to talk to you." "Oh?" she said, taking a seat. "We've been piecing together Eli's story," the officer began. "He's still a bit shaken, but from what we've gathered, he was taken from his home a few days ago. He doesn't know who the person was, just that they brought him to the abandoned garage and left him there." Mrs. Porter gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "That poor boy, how awful!" The officer nodded. "We're lucky you called when you did. It could have ended much worse if he'd been left there any longer. But we're curious. How did you know something was wrong?" Mrs. Porter hesitated, feeling a bit self-conscious. "It was Kobus, my parrot. He wouldn't stop shouting, 'Help! Help!' for 2 whole days. At first, I thought he'd just picked up a phrase from the television, but when I heard the faint cry from the garage, I started to wonder." The officer raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "A parrot led you to call us?" Mrs. Porter nodded. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but Kobus is, well, he's special. He's always been clever, but this was something else entirely." The officer smiled. "Special or not, you and your parrot saved a life. Eli wouldn't have made it much longer without help." Mrs. Porter felt a swell of pride, though her thoughts quickly turned back to the boy. What's going to happen to him? Does he have a family? The officer's expression grew somber. "We're still trying to track down his parents, but it seems he might have been in a tough situation at home. Child Services is getting involved to ensure he's placed somewhere safe." Mrs. Porter's heart ached for the boy. She couldn't imagine what he had been through, alone and frightened in that garage. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that Kobus's intervention hadn't been mere coincidence. Over the next few days, Mrs. Porter kept herself busy, though her thoughts often drifted to Eli. She wondered how he was doing and whether he had found a safe place to stay. Kobus, meanwhile, seemed to return to his usual antics, squawking cheerful greetings and mimicking the sounds of her antique clock. But every time she looked at him, she felt a renewed sense of gratitude. Somehow, this eccentric bird had been the key to saving a life. One afternoon, as Mrs. Porter was watering her garden, a knock at the door startled her. She set down her watering can and hurried inside, finding the officer from the station standing on her porch. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Porter," he said with a warm smile. "I thought you'd like an update on Eli." "Oh, please come in," she said, gesturing toward the living room. She offered him tea, which he politely declined before sitting down opposite him. "Eli is doing well," the officer said. "He's with a foster family for now, but he's been asking about the person and the parrot who saved him. I thought you might like to visit him." Mrs. Porter's eyes widened. "He wants to see me. And Kobus." The officer chuckled. "Well, more Kobus than you, if I'm honest. He's been telling everyone about the magic bird that saved him." Mrs. Porter laughed, shaking her head. "I suppose I owe it to Kobus to let him bask in his heroism. When can we visit?" "How about tomorrow?" the officer suggested. "I'll arrange it with the foster family." Mrs. Porter agreed, her heart brimming with anticipation. Little did she know the meeting would be the beginning of something far greater than she could have imagined. The next morning, Mrs. Porter carefully prepared for the visit with Eli. She packed a small basket of treats, cookies she'd baked the night before, a few fruits, and a little plush parrot she'd found in a nearby toy store. Kobus, ever curious, perched on the back of her chair as she prepared, his bright green and yellow feathers shimmering in the morning light. "Are you ready to meet a boy who thinks you're magic?" she asked him playfully. Kobus squawked, fluffing his feathers as if in agreement. She laughed, feeling a strange mix of excitement and nervousness about the meeting. When the officer arrived to escort her to the foster home, Mrs. Porter carefully placed Kobus in his travel cage, a large open carrier that allowed him to perch comfortably. Kobus seemed intrigued by the outing, letting out the occasional help, help as they drove. Mrs. Porter and the officer exchanged amused glances. The foster home was a cozy bungalow nestled on a quiet street. As they approached, Mrs. Porter noticed Eli sitting on the porch, his small frame wrapped in a soft sweater. He looked healthier than the last time she'd seen him. His cheeks had regained some color, and his posture was less guarded. But there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his wide eyes. "Hello, Eli," Mrs. Porter said warmly as she stepped out of the car carrying Kobus's cage. "Do you remember me?" Eli nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the bird in the carrier. "Is that him?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with awe. Mrs. Porter crouched down, opening the carrier so Kobus could step onto her gloved hand. "This is Kobus. He's been very eager to meet you." As Kobus emerged, he tilted his head, studying Eli with his sharp black eyes. Then, in a clear, cheerful voice, he squawked, "Help! Help!" Eli's face lit up, a wide smile breaking across his face. "He really says it!" he exclaimed, clapping his hands in delight. For a moment, he looked like any other child, carefree and full of wonder. Kobus, sensing the boy's excitement, flapped his wings slightly and bobbed his head. "Good boy," he added, his voice mimicking Mrs. Porter's tone perfectly. Eli laughed, a sound that filled the air with a warmth Mrs. Porter hadn't realized she was missing. She set Kobus on a perch the foster family had prepared on the porch and handed Eli the plush parrot. "I thought you might like this," she said. "Kobus can't stay with you all the time, but maybe this can remind you of him." Eli hugged the plush toy tightly, his expression turning serious. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for finding me." Mrs. Porter's heart swelled. She reached out to gently ruffle his hair. "It wasn't just me. Kobus knew you needed help. He wouldn't let me rest until I listened." Eli looked at Kobus, his eyes filled with a kind of reverence. "He's a hero," he said firmly. The visit lasted well into the afternoon, with Kobus delighting Eli and the foster parents with his antics. He mimicked their laughter, repeated their words, and even whistled a cheerful tune that Eli tried to imitate. Mrs. Porter watched the interaction with a sense of awe. It was clear that Kobus had formed an instant bond with the boy, as though he understood the role he'd played in saving him. When it was time to leave, Eli clung to Mrs. Porter's hand, his expression pleading. "Will you come back?" he asked. "Of course, sweetheart," she promised, "and Kobus will come too." As they drove back home, Mrs. Porter couldn't stop thinking about Eli's bright smile and the joy Kobus had brought him. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her quiet routines. Kobus, sitting contentedly in his carrier, seemed to sense her thoughts, letting out a soft chirp as if to reassure her. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Porter and Kobus became regular visitors at Eli's foster home. Each time they arrived, Eli's face would light up, and the three of them would spend hours talking, playing, and laughing. Kobus quickly became Eli's confidant, a source of comfort and happiness in a life that had been filled with uncertainty. One afternoon, while they were sitting under a tree in the backyard, Eli turned to Mrs. Porter, his expression serious. "Do you think Kobus knew I was in the garage because I was lonely?" Mrs. Porter blinked, taken aback by the question. She looked at Kobus, who was perched on a nearby branch, preening his feathers. "I think Kobus has a special way of sensing when someone needs help," she said thoughtfully. "But you're not lonely anymore, are you?" Eli shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Not anymore." As the weeks turned into months, Eli's circumstances began to change. His foster family, though kind and attentive, expressed that they weren't in a position to adopt him long-term. Mrs. Porter couldn't stop thinking about him, her heart aching at the thought of him facing more uncertainty. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she found herself talking to Kobus. "What do you think, old friend?" she asked. "Could we make room for one more?" Kobus tilted his head, his black eyes glinting in the light. Then, as if answering her question, he let out a cheerful, "Good boy." Mrs. Porter laughed, feeling a wave of determination wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: her life, and Kobus's, had changed forever the moment they found Eli. The day Mrs. Porter filed the paperwork to foster, Eli felt like the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. The process wasn't without challenges, inspections, interviews, and countless forms to fill out. But through it all, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Kobus, of course, was her constant companion during the process. The parrot seemed to sense the importance of the moment, often sitting on her shoulder as she spoke with social workers or filled out forms at her kitchen table. "Good boy," he would squawk, as though cheering her on, bringing a much-needed smile to her face during stressful moments. When the day finally came for Eli to move in, Mrs. Porter couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness. She stood on her front porch, clutching Kobus's carrier as the foster agency's car pulled up. Eli stepped out, his belongings packed neatly into a single duffel bag. Despite the warm autumn sun, he hugged his sweater tightly around himself, his expression unsure. Mrs. Porter crouched down to meet his gaze. "Welcome home, Eli," she said gently, her voice filled with warmth. Eli's eyes darted toward Kobus, who immediately chirped, "Good boy." The familiar sound brought a small smile to his face, and he nodded shyly. He stepped forward, gripping Mrs. Porter's hand tightly as they walked inside. The house, already cozy with its overstuffed furniture and shelves of knickknacks, now felt more alive than ever. Mrs. Porter had set up a small room for Eli, complete with soft blankets, a sturdy bed, and a desk for him to draw or do homework. Kobus's cage had been placed near the window where the parrot could keep an eye on the boy during the day. "This is your room," Mrs. Porter said, watching as Eli surveyed the space. "You can decorate it however you like." Eli glanced around, his small fingers brushing against the edge of the desk. "It's nice," he murmured, his voice soft. Kobus squawked from his cage, "Help! Help!" drawing a laugh from Eli. Mrs. Porter smiled, feeling the tension in the air dissipate. Over the next few weeks, Eli began to settle into his new life. The routines were simple but comforting: shared meals at the dining table, afternoons spent playing with Kobus, and evenings filled with stories. Eli grew bolder in his interactions with the parrot, teaching Kobus new phrases and laughing when the bird repeated them in his playful squawk. One rainy afternoon, Mrs. Porter found Eli sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building a small fort out of cushions. Kobus was perched on the arm of the couch, watching intently. "What are you building there?" Mrs. Porter asked, sitting down beside him. "A castle," Eli replied, his face lighting up with excitement. "Kobus is the king." Kobus tilted his head, letting out a cheerful "good boy" that made them both laugh. Mrs. Porter felt her heart swell. Moments like these were reminders of how far Eli had come from the quiet, withdrawn boy she'd first met. But life wasn't without its challenges. Eli still carried the scars of his past, and there were nights when he would wake up crying, haunted by nightmares. On those nights, Kobus would squawk softly as if sensing Eli's distress, and Mrs. Porter would sit by his bed holding his hand until he fell asleep again. One night, after a particularly bad dream, Eli looked up at Mrs. Porter with tear-filled eyes. "Why did my parents leave me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mrs. Porter's heart ached. She sat down beside him, stroking his hair gently. "Sometimes people make choices that we can't understand," she said carefully. "But that doesn't mean it was your fault. You are a wonderful, brave boy, Eli, and you are so loved." Kobus, from his perch on the windowsill, let out a quiet, "good boy," as though echoing her sentiment. Eli smiled faintly, wiping his tears. As the months passed, the bond between Mrs. Porter, Eli, and Kobus grew stronger. They became a family in every sense of the word, each finding joy and healing in the other's presence. Eli's confidence blossomed. He made friends at school, tried out for the soccer team, and even started drawing pictures of Kobus, proudly displaying them on the fridge. Mrs. Porter watched him with a sense of pride and gratitude. She often found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since the day Kobus had first squawked, "Help, help," in her living room. The parrot's intuition had led her to Eli, and together they had created a new beginning. One sunny afternoon, they decided to take a trip to the local park. Eli ran ahead, his laughter ringing through the air as Kobus, perched on Mrs. Porter's shoulder, squawked happily. They found a quiet spot under a tree, spreading out a blanket and enjoying a picnic together. As they sat there, Eli turned to Mrs. Porter, his expression serious. "Do you think Kobus knew I needed help that day?" Mrs. Porter smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "I think Kobus has a special way of knowing when someone needs him," she said. "Just like I knew you needed me." Eli looked at Kobus, his face thoughtful. "I'm glad he found me," he said softly. "And I'm glad you found me too." The bond between the three of them was unshakable, built on love, trust, and the simple joys of everyday life. Mrs. Porter couldn't have imagined how much one little parrot could change their lives, but as she watched Eli and Kobus play together under the golden sunlight, she knew one thing for certain: they were exactly where they were meant to be. And Kobus, the parrot, with the keen instincts and a knack for repeating words, had truly brought them all together in the most unexpected and beautiful way.